Let's go ahead and introduce our special guest. His name is Omar Zahzah. He is a writer, poet, organizer of Lebanese and Palestinian descent. He's an assistant professor at Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies at San Francisco State University. And he is the author of a new book titled Terms of Servitude: Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestine Liberation Struggle. Let's go ahead and bring him in. Welcome, Omar. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
So I'm excited to talk to you. I want to show everyone your book here. Here is the book. It's called Terms of Servitude. And of course, it's by Omar. Omar, your focus is primarily on the digital platforms, the tech industry, and how they have worked to silence not just Palestinian voices, but to also aid in censorship around that particular issue. What did you find in your research of doing this? And in particular, is this something that you noticed after October 7th, or has this been going on prior to that?
Thank you so much for that question. So I found a lot of things. I think a lot of us relate to social media. We're talking on YouTube right now. It's probably going to be cross-posted to all of the digital platforms that you noted in your introduction, right? We tend to connect to social media as this site that allows us to propose alternatives to the legacy corporate media messaging, right? So there's always been this element of we can have an alternative voice represented by taking to these platforms. My research was about how Palestinians turned to digital platforms like, the meta platforms, Facebook, Instagram, like, Twitter, formerly now X, and turned to it and successfully advanced their narratives about the actual character of the Palestinian struggle as being a outgrowth of ongoing settler colonialism, right? And that when this success was just a little too prominent to the point where even corporate legacy media narratives began to be noticeably challenged, you started to have mass censorship on these platforms. Now, I began looking at this in 2021, around the time of what some of your viewers may remember as the uprisings in Sheikh Jarrah, the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood. This was the standout moment of what I was looking at, where people started to talk about how what had previously been a routine experience of Palestinians facing eviction orders suddenly were able to not just challenge that potential outcome, but actually challenge the very narratives about how they had been represented through a savvy and sophisticated use of digital platforms, to such an extent that they began to be platformed by legacy corporate media and, bring their narratives to the fore in that aspect as well. But unfortunately, they were a little too successful, and we began to see mass censorship by platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And, again, staying in this 2021, 2022 moment, this censorship was so vast that this was the first time that corporate legacy media really began to poke behind the curtain and say, okay, what's going on? This is so collective, in its scope, that there has to be something else happening. And of course, you have these big tech companies saying, well, no, this is a glitch. This is the result of an error in moderation. So we'll do better, right? Now it's become so routine to have anti-Palestinian content moderation, which is what my book looks at, right? So it was definitely prior to the latest genocide in Gaza. But unfortunately, what has happened is that since that genocide, this anti-Palestinian content moderation has been so normalized that it's become par for the course. And it's become par for the course at a moment where the stakes are high, because a post being able to be seen can be the difference between life and death, right? So even as I finished the book under slightly different circumstances from when I began it, because I do think particularly with the Sheikh Jarrah uprisings, with the narrative shifts that felt so palpable at that time, there was, I don't know if optimism is the right word, but there was this sense that a change is happening and this censorship can only go so far. Now we've seen these companies take this and run with it, and they basically incorporated it as a standard operating practice. So I do think that that's something that needs to continue to be challenged and called out. But I'd say the normalization of these censorship practices is what has unfortunately evolved at a time where its implications are the most dire, which is a time of genocide.
This is correct. I have seen a number of Palestinian accounts on Twitter all of a sudden just disappear. Palestinian organization accounts disappear on Twitter. It's interesting. This is something that should have been in the Twitter files, to be honest with you. I've seen that censorship as well on Facebook from a number of accounts. Where do you think the pressure came from?
Well, it's no secret that the Israeli government has been very attuned to the impact that social media can have on hearts and minds, right? For example, the genesis of what became, the kind of ongoing attempt to ban and sort of, de-autonomize TikTok, or at least basically fully control it. That began with a flurry of, these comments about, how this is promoting quote unquote Hamas propaganda, how it's turning the youth, to be more pro-Palestine. And of course, the ADL, Greenblatt came out and said, we have a TikTok problem, that infamous quote, right? So it's no secret that the Israeli government, that Zionist institutions are very savvy about how social media is, part and parcel of broader narrative shifts. So there's been a lot of pressure from Israel proper. But at the same time, I think it's really important to note, and this is part of the distinction that I try to draw in my book, these companies are also willingly engaging in this censorship because they're out for their bottom line, right? They are not interested, despite all their propaganda, and especially the propaganda that we were awash with from the 2010s and on about how social media is revolutionary, how it creates, counter publics, new democratic opportunities. They are interested in their bottom line. They're interested in the outsized hegemony that they are able to practice on our broader social lives. And they recognize that the best way to protect that hegemony, the best way to protect their bottom line, their corporate interests, their broader political alliances, is to work hand in glove with the Israeli settler colonial project. So it's not just an issue of individuals lobbying, right? Some people will even say, well, look at, the number of Israelis who are, on the board of companies like Meta, or look at the number of, ex-Israeli government officials who work in Meta Post, for example. But even the decision to have those people fill those positions is a direct choice on the part of those companies. So I think we really need to be aware of the fact that what we're dealing with is a conscious choice by these companies to partner, with Israeli settler colonialism, genocide, and apartheid, and that the anti-Palestinian concept moderation we see is a direct outgrowth of that choice.
That's 100% correct. I don't know if everyone is aware, but it was reported the other day that it appears that the owner of Oracle, who I believe is also a billionaire, is purchasing TikTok. He's also a Zionist. I called out the CBS merger here with Barry Weiss.
Mm-hmm.
And I, like I said before, the Free Press, like that outlet that she started, is not like it was like this wasn't like a top-notch like outlet that was out there for her to receive this opportunity. It's very clear the message that they want to send across, that they really want to control the messages that are being sent on these platforms, especially when it comes to Palestine resistance and of course, especially Gaza. And what is really interesting to me is when you get into the situation in the West Bank, which Hamas is not in the West Bank. And if you notice, you never really hear them mention that. You never hear them mention the West Bank because they can't say, well, they're trying to fight Hamas. Hamas is not in the West Bank. But yet at the same time, you do have settlers that are going into the West Bank and they're stealing homes from Palestinians. We've all seen the videos, and I've seen them for years. So that didn't start after October 7th. And I think that the big concern is that this message got out to too many people, and Israel has really been exposed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's 100% correct. We have this kind of normalization of censorship, but there's a certain point to where, exactly as you're saying, the images are out there. There's really nothing left in terms of any more information that we need to be able to see this for what it is, right? This is a genocide. This is a colonial project. Palestinians have been saying this for years, for decades. They continue to say this now, and they continue to heroically try to broadcast in real time and get their footage, their recordings, and their messages out to the rest of us in order to inspire change. This has always been about these big companies capitulating to the Israeli mandate to silence, eliminate, and erase Palestinians, and really the very idea of Palestine, from the physical and the digital terrain. There's never been a reason to accept any of these excuses, but now more than ever, there's really nothing left that we need to see. There's nothing left that we need to hear in order to act and to resist this for what it is. So, it's unfortunate that, these companies are locking down and continuing to move in this direction, but we need to continue to resist it. And we need to continue to also be savvy about the fact that what we're seeing is the collusion of corporate capitalism and imperialism with the latest example of settler colonialism in our modern day and age, which is the Zionist project.
Yeah, I always tell people this is the final stage of colonialism, right? I mean, Netanyahu's very clear about the Greater Israel project and what they want to accomplish. There was an article here. I want to highlight this that you wrote for Electronic Intifada, which we love over here. They do great work. Dell's complicity in Israel's genocide. So you wrote this article July 22nd of this year. This is another one. The tech companies, like tech companies like Dell, etc., how they are complicit in all of this.
Yeah. And, working on that piece, first of all, there's so many ways in which Dell is complicit with what I found in that piece, right? Their direct collaboration with the Israeli military, with the government, with different branches of the military, as well as their use. This was one of I think the most shocking things, but also a detail that made a lot of sense is that, when we talk about the coordinated kill lists that are made through AI generation, right? We're talking about things like the lavender and the gospel that was broken by, 972, right? Those lists are actually powered through Dell's hardware. So, we focus a lot on the cloud storage, and the cloud storage infrastructure, but it's also the physical infrastructure that tech companies provide that make the running of these programs possible. And, this kind of led me to, well, I shouldn't say it made me think it for the first time, but it really affirmed this idea that big tech as an industry is so entrenched in Israeli settler colonialism and now the genocide that the real surprise should be if we find the company is not when we find more evidence of another big tech company doing it, right? And of course, this is part of what, this is exactly what Francesca Albanese, exposed in her report, right? Which is specifically on big tech complicity in, the settler colonial project that is now also culminating in this latest genocide. And I don't know exactly what the next point of pressure is going to be, but I completely agree with the findings of that report that we need to start to act under the mandate that these companies know exactly what they're doing and they need to face the same kind of accountability as we would give, to an actual foreign government that is engaging in these practices, right? That's one of the takeaways of the report. We need to think about the decision to do business under these conditions, not only to be, to ignore it, but to actually use your products and your expertise to fortify those as something that is legally sanctionable. We need to actually continue to agitate and to think about how to start bringing pressure to big tech as an industry, because it is so awash in the blood of Palestinians at this moment in time, right? That, again, the surprise would be when we find a good outlier, right? I don't think we need any more evidence about how corrupt this industry is, but unfortunately, they keep coming forward with new receipts for us to find.
Yeah, I think a lot of people may not be aware how the tech industry is involved in the genocide in Gaza. And I think, that announcement from Francesca, I think that really woke a lot of people up. And you see the response to that was to put sanctions on her. How do you feel about the current censorship that's taken place right now? Like right after the death of Charlie Kirk, it just seems like Like I said, I've never seen the government respond to someone's death this way. I feel like they're using it as an excuse. But how do you feel about the extremes that are being taken now to silence voices?
Yeah, great question. And I was just talking about this, on another podcast recently. I know it's, kind of the order of the day. I am not totally surprised. I think that, seeing the experiences that people have had in terms of facing the workplace censure that they have, for giving critical messaging, seeing people who are trying to push back on the very standard script that they're apparently expected to give, right, within these very rigid, fine lines, instead of doing what I think we need to do in this moment, which is really to challenge this language of political violence on its face, right? A lot of people have tried to advance the conversation of, well, we're supposed to condemn political violence. Our very society, our country runs and thrives on political violence. There's so many different forms of political violence that we're not condemning. What we're being expected to do is to critique this one act while we have an entire genocide happening, while we have communities who are brutalized by police violence, while we have poverty, while we have medical inequality. All of these different things are forms of political violence. If we really want to talk about political violence, we need to be able to actually talk about it in a structural sense. Of course, that's not the conversation we're supposed to have. It's almost as though this discourse is kind of a bait and switch, where there's a little bit of bait for people to take when they actually say what they think. If it's straying from the script that we're supposed to be given, then they're subjected to all of this censorship, right? So it's not surprising, but it definitely reveals the kind of partisan character and the bad faith of these conversations. And I think it shows the really coordinated nature of how censorship works. Even when we get into different topics, when you're still thinking about questions of structural oppression, that's something you're not supposed to be able to entertain. And the platforms that are very savvy to the right, just as they're savvy to all the current, forms of power, are going to make no haste in making sure that you don't have space, on their products to speak it.
I want to ask you about this one. This is chapter 9 in your book. Why big tech's control of social media can't stop anti-colonial resistance. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think that it seems like the powers that be feel as though if they control the platforms, or if they control just the message that is getting out, that then things will move in their favor. Why do you believe that these actions will not stop colonial resistance, anti-colonial resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first, very broadly, I think they're never going to stop anti-colonial resistance, because it's the very concept that animates the overall spirit of the book. Once consciousness is gained in general, it's something that can't be taken away. Sure, you can delete a post, you can ban an account, you can burn a book, you can do all these things, but you can't change the fact that people have been swayed. Now, in this chapter in particular, I was looking at what unfortunately has become a very common phenomenon, right? Which is the distribution of videos by individuals in the Israeli occupation forces who document themselves engaging in all kinds of acts of, heinous torture of Palestinians, the destruction of civilian infrastructure in this really cruel and sadistic way, right? And I was contrasting that to the videos you see from resistance forces, right? Documenting, for example, the striking of military targets, right? The planting of devices on tanks. And I was saying, look at the contrast that you have here. On the one hand, you have this colonial military force that is proudly documenting its sadism and torture. And on the other hand, you have these, military resistance forces that are documenting their coordinated targeting of military infrastructure and targets. And I was saying in that chapter in particular, these disparate uses of social media demonstrate perfectly the colonial character of the Palestinian struggle. It's very clear when you look at that content, who is the colonizer and who is the colonized, right? That said, I do think that there's also, in general, a broader point to that term, because in general, all forms of anti-colonial resistance cannot be stopped, right? They'll never be stopped by censoring a platform. They'll never be stopped by censoring a type of media, because the savviness of the colonized, will always outwit the control and the power of the colonizer.
Yeah, I hear you. It's like they forget that, like, especially if you look back in the day, like the civil rights movement, for example, there was no social media during that time, but people can still organize. So even censoring those platforms doesn't stop people from organizing and getting out in the streets. It's like we have to take it back to old school. And speaking of organizing, I wanted to get your take on 11 demands. My producer came up with this idea of 11 demands, and he was saying that we really do need to have some type of a movement to happen, right? Because we're seeing that the politicians in particular, a lot of them are serving big business, big money interests, and of course, the genocide, like, to be honest. And one of the things that he points out here in 11 demands, it says real change starts with demands. Healthcare for all, a minimum standard of living for everyone in the wars. These are just a couple of them. And it's referred to as MCDS, money, corruptions, demands, and solutions. I'll show you the 11 demands here. Fix big money in politics and government, healthcare for all, a minimum standard of living for everyone in the wars. So this is a really big one, I think, for a lot of us. Racial and criminal justice reform, respond to the climate emergency, reject censorship, another big one, immigration reform, an election system we can trust, and revamp taxation and funding. And last but not least, democratize the enterprise. What do you think of the idea of 11 demands, like for real democracy, starting a movement around something like this, where people can just focus on the demands and not focus on a political party that they are a part of, for example? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think I feel like it's unfortunate that my reaction is a bit of surprise. Wow, you mean concrete goals that people can that center the people, as opposed to thinking about the corporate interests of one party or another of this so-called duopoly that we have, right? I think one of the main issues we've seen for years has been precisely the absence of concrete, actionable goals that are going to benefit the best interests of the general public. And I think the more that we can start to inject that into actual political practice, as opposed to having these personality wars, or as opposed to having ultimately this so-called two-party system that is really just all locked in on capitalism, imperialism, and genocide, right? The better.
Yeah, when I would look at the Gaza situation, and it's the same under both administrations, in the sense that the genocide started under the Biden-Harris administration, and Kamala didn't want to withhold, said she would not withhold weapons from Israel. And we had the Trump administration, who also is not withholding weapons from Israel. And it's very clear, like, both parties are all bought in for Israel. There may be some politicians that are a part of those parties that don't support it, but the parties as a whole, they do support what is happening with the U.S.-Israel relationship. And some of the politicians have come forward and been very, very blatant that they do support the killing of Palestinian people. One in particular, Congressman, I don't know how he got in there, but Congress member Randy Fine has been very nasty with his remarks about the Palestinian people. So it's just, we're looking at a political system that is bought, that is very corrupt. And even those who went into those parties to try to do something particularly different, they end up either going along with it, or they give like a milquetoast response, or they're pushed out. And so that's why we ask about focusing on demands and creating a different type of movement.
Yeah. And I mean, I think with that, you start to find new ways to chip away at just the bipartisan entrenchment, really, in death, dispossession, exploitation, and extraction, both domestically and internationally, right? The fact that you can have such dehumanization across the board is precisely because of the imperialist status quo that basically is the motor engine, of American politics. And so, the more we can start to chip away at that and challenge that, and also try to find real solutions that benefit people as opposed to maintaining the hierarchical situation that we have now, again, the better.
Awesome. Omar, where can people find your work?
So people can, I'd say keep a lookout on publications like Electronic Intifada and Mondeweiss. Follow Project Censored, who's the Censored Press is a co-publisher of my book. And I'm also on X at Dr. Omar Zahzah, Facebook and Instagram at Omar Zahzah.
Awesome. Omar, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time. Pleasure.
Bye. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was Omar Zahzah. Awesome, awesome. Check out his book if you get the opportunity to do so. Again, the name of the book, I'll bring it back up here. It is called Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, Digital Settler Colonialism in Palestinian Liberation Struggle. So definitely check that out. We got to focus on all of the pieces, and that includes tech as well. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.